Hi, I'm Jane Ruffino. I am a UX writer, a content designer. I'm also a contemporary archaeologist. And most important to me, I am the mom of this tiny human named Josephine. Part of the idea for my talk came from obviously my years as a content designer dealing with forms. And, you know, we're supposed to solve problems for users, but a form always stands between our user and the thing they want to do. So a form by its nature is already a problem we're putting in front of users. But today I specifically want to talk about the power asymmetries that are part of a lot of the forms that we make and use all the time. So the first thing I want to show you is here's a sort of pet peeve, right? Like this is a problem. I was renewing some domain names on Namecheap because buying domain names makes me feel like I'm going to do all those projects. And I got this error message when I typed my address. I live in Sweden. I live in a place called Årsta, which is in Stockholm. And it tells me that my address isn't valid. I have to use English letters. But there are no English letters like this. These are Swedish letters. These are not diacritical marks. These are letters, or and ä. So I had to type like Arstavägen, which is a place that doesn't exist. And it also uses this term invalid, which, by the way, in content design, we're trying to move away from things like ableist associations, and we don't use words like this anymore. So that was annoying for me, but it can get worse. So if you're familiar with Ireland, you might know that the Irish language is one of Ireland's two official languages. So you would assume that somebody who uses Irish to spell their name, their address, maybe they speak it at home, can use a major service like Bank of Ireland. But here, Tig cannot type his name and it even tells him his name isn't valid. But a string of nonsense characters, that was perfectly valid. So that's something that you would assume wouldn't happen. And then you take the British retail chain River Island, and Cleona here was told that she mistyped her name. And if you are at all familiar with British colonialism and the reason that English is the more widely spoken language in Ireland, you will understand why this did not go down well. And then you have things like Mallory, the situation where Mallory Yu, this person was trying to log into letsgetchecked.com, and she was told that her name was too short. And there were a lot of people in the replies to this talking about how Asian names it's not uncommon for Asian last names to have two letters. So Wu is actually the 9th most popular name in China. Almost 27 million people have this name in China. So how often have you heard this? It works for most people. But if you can't make your service work for everybody who needs to use it, then you don't even have an MVP. I mean, who are most people? The V is supposed to be for viable, not for VIPs. And forms are often bad because they're designed to follow patterns. We clone these patterns whether or not they're good patterns. And so your form has inherited a bunch of errors that we are probably replicating, and we're all doing this, right? But forms are not just collections of components. Most of the web is forms. My friend Kim says the web is just 3 forms in a trench coat. And accessibility consultant Hayden Pickering refers to them as a 10,000 volt electromagnet for attracting usability problems. And even beyond usability problems, we need to talk about power. Forms are all of these things. We use them to apply, register, log in, pay, leave a service or a place, book something, confirm something. And I'm focused today on forms that involve people's personal data and how collecting this is not a neutral act, and it can sometimes be an act of violence. So very sadly, late anthropologist David Graeber writes about forms in his book, The Utopia of Rules. And he talks about how they're parts of cultures of efficiency, quantification, evaluation. And we're very wrong if we think that they are a rational human impulse. And he says it's felt most cruelly by the poor, who are constantly monitored by an intrusive army of moralistic box tickers who are assessing their child rearing skills, inspecting their food cabinets to see if they really are cohabiting with their partners, determining if they have been trying hard enough to find a job, or whether their medical conditions are really sufficiently severe to disqualify them from physical labor. All rich countries now employ legions of functionaries whose primary function is to make poor people feel bad about themselves. Because the only thing worse than filling in a dehumanizing form is as having somebody stand there and fill in the form about you, and you're not even allowed to look at it. And, the professional classes are also not immune to this. He talks about this culture of evaluation and audit and constant performance reviews, that nothing is real, that cannot be quantified, tabulated, or entered into some interface or quarterly report. We are all subject to bureaucratic decisions that do things like rank us out of 10. This is not a normal human thing to do. And one of the reasons that forms are such a problem is actually when they're bad, they are not just interactions, they're little borders. What happens if we see forms as little borders? And this brings me to the other reason that I wanted to do this talk and why it's so important to me. And I think one of the reasons I might be a bit sensitive to bad form experiences, both as a designer and a user, is I've spent more than half of my life and all of my adult life as an immigrant. And when you are an immigrant, you are constantly subjected to these administrative procedures that can be super high stakes. Like a form is never just a form. And so here's an example. In 2013, I applied to move to Sweden to live with my Swedish partner. And I was living in Ireland, where I had been for almost a decade and a half. And that immigration system was like chaotic and unpredictable. It was really, really difficult to navigate. And I was still not a citizen, no permanent, no long-term rights. So here I am, I open this form, and it seems pretty straightforward. And, if you have a really long surname, you might struggle with this. So that is the first problem with this form. The first really big problem is if you are somebody from one of the, I think 16, there might be more countries now, countries that allow a third gender on the passport. There's no way for you to, or like if you have that, if you are that third gender, there's no way for you to answer this question honestly. The one that tripped me up was the marital status question. And I was married in 2008 and separated in 2010. Now in Sweden, there's no status of separated. In Ireland, it is a legal status. It is a legal status that usually has no paperwork attached to it. And this is not an option on the form. At the time, there was a law in Ireland that said you had to wait at least 4 years before you could apply for a divorce, like a baby think it over period. And so I could not figure out what to do. I'm like looking at this going, are they going to look at this and be like, who is this person who's married to a guy in Ireland and wants to move to a completely different guy in Sweden? And I felt like, am I going to have to subject myself to some like moral authority for this? So we got in touch with immigration and they said like, just answer it however and explain it in the box. And like, this is what the box looked like, which I thought like, that doesn't look like where I should write that information. So, when you're applying for a residency permit, you're not just filling out an application. You are actually applying for your own life. You don't want to get fired from your own life. And this is a form that would not let me tell the truth. So what happens when such a high stakes form will not let you tell the truth? Now, in my case, this was solvable, right? And after 8 years, and I had my permanent residency. I had to wait 2.5 years for my citizenship application. I got rejected once. They sent an automated letter to my newborn baby telling her she had no right to be in the country. But I finally got my citizenship, and it sucked. And if it sucked for me, somebody with my advantages, how much worse can it get? There's also a problem where when people first arrive in Sweden, it can take months and months for them to get what's called their person number. And you need that to get what's called your bank ID. And your bank ID is used, it's a digital identifier, and it's issued by your bank. And you need it you need your personal number to open a bank account, and then you need bank ID to bank, but you also need it for government documents, you need it for making a doctor's appointment. You need it for a lot of commercial services. Use this instead of having like a login form. So a lot of designers are like, let's get rid of all the forms. Everyone hates forms. And inadvertently, they're creating a frictionless experience for one group of users and a hard border for another group of users that have no workaround. There's often no workaround if something uses bank ID. So if you are, if you don't have this, if you don't have your person number, you can't get a bank account. Maybe your salary is getting paid into a bank account in whatever country you were living in before. Maybe you're still living in like an illegal overpriced sublet because you can't get a legitimate apartment until you have a bank account. And you could be using your old phone number because you can't get a proper bill phone. So if we design forms that only accommodate people who have made it to the frictionlessness stage, then we're leaving out this whole chunk of users. And this is not an uncommon problem, by the way. This is a really common problem. And so it makes me think, like, as we localize our products and as we expand internationally, why are we doing collectively such a bad job acknowledging that people also move, not just products?